Sam, in VC land, making stuff happen. You've got an understanding, finger to the pulse from what I understand, working in the environment, seeing a lot of these projects, some of them you guys getting behind, but seeing projects where people are looking to really make a difference, in terms of what's actually happening in the real world. A lot of stuff lives in the pixels and, on screen. A lot of stuff, moves with finances, with numbers, but it's really special when some of these real projects, can move the needle when they're, where they impact water or land, or whatnot. So I would love it if you could take a moment to just share a bit about yourself, introduce yourself and your company and what you guys are focused on.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Caleb. It's been a really weird path to the seat I sit in now. I haven't figured out how to say this super succinctly, but I'll do my best. I actually started my career teaching 7th grade math. I taught in Memphis in Tennessee. I'm from New York City originally, but I did a teaching program where I got placed in Memphis. And in this process of teaching 7th and 8th grade math, I was exposed to a lot of things that I didn't expect to be true in the 21st century, right? Like New York's got its share of poverty and inequality. But Memphis is on a totally different level of systemic oppression, institutional racism, things like that are more alive and well in certain pockets of the U.S. than in others. But while I was teaching, I started a nonprofit with a friend of mine to help low-income kids launch businesses. And I could talk about that for a while, but it was really exciting work. And we would actually invest dollars into these individuals and let them build something, or give them resources, I should say, not let them, give them resources to build some, a vision that they had for a product or service that was lacking in their community. We got data several years in that the average student that had been through our program was making a starting salary 15% higher than the median household income in their city. Which was some pretty compelling and exciting data. And then we got funding from some huge national foundations. We've gotten funding from Steve Jobs' family office, and national foundations like the Kresge Foundation. And part of the reason why was this wasn't just about building a business over a 16-week period, which was, kind of the core program. We also had wraparound services that were focused on compounding skills that you get while building a business that our schools are not doing a good job of teaching, and they're certainly not doing a good job of compounding and building on as young people grow. In the mid 2015s, I started to believe that part of our political divide was driven by an opportunity gap that exists between rural and urban areas. Poverty in Memphis is pretty severe, but if you go 2.5 hours outside Memphis, it's a different level of inequity and poverty, right? Like that tri-state area, Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, Memphis sits right at the corner of those 3 states, and those 3 states have their share of real economic challenges. And so I started to think about how we could bring this program that had some success in urban areas to rural areas. I got a Fulbright grant to go research that in Poland. Poland's a super interesting place for this research for a bunch of reasons. We can, dig deeper on that a little bit later if you want. But I spent a year in Poland, and as part of that Fulbright, I got to go to startup competitions all around the continent because my research was focused on economic development in rural areas. And I got to see these really cool startups. And 10 years ago, Europe was ahead of the curve on impact investing, or what we call impact investing now. And so when I saw really cool startups, I would send them to some of the family offices and foundations that supported my nonprofit. I'd say, hey, I don't know anything about this, satellite company tracking methane emissions, but you care about this stuff. Do you want to take a look? And so they started writing checks into some of the startups that I sent them, and I would write small angel checks alongside them. It was an irresponsible amount of money for me at the time. I was making $40,000 a year writing $10,000 angel checks. Like, it was the worst portfolio construction you could possibly imagine. But it was a really cool experience, right? Like, those reps were worth their weight in gold. And then when I came back, stateside after my time at Fulbright, I had written checks myself. I knew where some follow-on money was. I had experience now assessing startups, and those are all skills pretty valuable for venture capital. And so I got into venture capital, and I've now been doing it for 8 years.
That is so cool. I love, it's funny, in an entrepreneurial just chat that I'm in, one of the questions that had come up was, hey, what is paradoxical about entrepreneurship that, maybe people don't realize? And to me, after thinking about it, the thought was that entrepreneurs are some of the best at problem solving, and yet some of the most important problems to be solved in the world are thought best to be solved by nonprofits. And it's not that I don't think that nonprofits are capable of it, but in my very limited experience and observation and interest in nonprofit space, as well as the for-profit, often nonprofits have a mentality of receiving, donations and then stewarding that to a point where it is now all gone and now we need more. Whereas the entrepreneurial mindset for an entrepreneur who's building something sustainably is to have these things regenerate, be adding more value than you're extracting. And so it's an interesting relationship. It's not that, one is needed without the other. But I think it's so special to see where you're finding that intersection between both, where the opportunity, you're giving opportunity for people to take an idea, expand on it, kind of coach them through it or guide to a point where they're presenting that idea, that signal goes out there, and that signal is met on the opposite side of resources or opportunity to be able to help cultivate it. So a very special point in that sort of Venn diagram of, those with the idea or that desire to solve that problem, those sort of coaching yourself in that mix, kind of facilitating, encouraging, and then those on this side, whether it's financial resources or relationships or opening doors to make that happen.
Yeah, I really appreciate that sentiment. I think I don't want to go down too deep of a rabbit hole on this, but I still wrestle with a thought that I had while working on this nonprofit. I think it might be fair to say that scale can be the antithesis of impact, which sounds really unsettling to a lot of people, especially in our current society where it's all about, if something good is happening, you need to multiply it, right? Like the more you do, the more significant of an impact you make. But each step of scale takes you further away from the core of what you do, or at least it pulls you, right? Like you have to work hard to stay grounded and to stay connected. And so seeing it on both sides of impact, the nonprofit side of impact and the for-profit side of impact, I think it's, we heard from foundations when we had a nonprofit, hey, how do you get to, 10x more students? How do you 10x your impact? And I don't know if that's the right question. And it sort of speaks to this point you're making about what is the goal of a nonprofit versus what is the goal of a for-profit entity. Because oftentimes we would say like our goal is to like work ourselves out of a job in the nonprofit world, right? Like we want to work ourselves to the point where this isn't a problem anymore. And the tricky thing is we sort of feel the same way at this for-profit venture capital firm that we're investing out of today. It's like, wouldn't it be great if we don't have to worry about climate change anymore because we're investing in technologies that are addressing climate change? So yeah, I mean, I think that's a thread you can pull on and go really deep on because it feels uncomfortable to a lot of different people. But the more you scale, sometimes the harder it gets to stay reconnected or stay connected, I should say, to the reason you do the work in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about business or initiatives, projects, et cetera, whatever labels we put on it, almost like an ecosystem. That not every business, like for example, if we were to grade a oak tree by the same KPIs quarter over quarter in its growth compared to a sunflower that just bolts, like the sunflowers in our yard, the stalks are like some of them huge by the end of the year, and they can be 10, 12 feet in the air. If that growth compared to an oak tree, and yet over time, the presence and power and raw potential. You cannot build a house, you cannot, the raw material,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I feel like in that, whether it's a boardroom or whether it's, whoever the leadership and whatnot is, to look at things and go, hey, is this a sunflower? Is this an oak tree? What is this? Is this, clover? Is this something that's, moss? Is this what aspect of the ecosystem? And then be able to have the self-awareness or just to be conscious of understanding how this fits in the ecosystem of things, because failure to do that, like even if we look at health in the body, an autoimmune disorder is literally cells in the body that are behaving in a way that they're not supposed to, or a tumor is overgrown, unchained growth. So growth as a metric, tumors are winning, they're exceeding their numbers, but it's, you realize it can actually be harmful in relation to the whole when it's out of context.
And you talked about paradoxes in entrepreneurship. I mean, it's such a powerful view that we hold, in high regard at our firm, which is, what paradoxes need to exist in an entrepreneur to find success in the work that we do. I've talked often about the Stockdale paradox, which Jim Collins wrote about it. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of the Stockdale paradox, but effectively, in a sentence, it's that the highest performing business leaders are able to simultaneously never lose belief and faith in the positive end outcome while acknowledging the harsh realities of their situation every single day. And I think, to your point on tumor growth and material quality, so often we completely lose sight of the harsh realities because we're sort of like, many of us are optimistic by nature, especially if we're in entrepreneurship and futurists. Like you absolutely have to have some form of belief in the end. But we can totally ignore, one, unintended consequences on the impact side. But we can also ignore like really legitimate hurdles like that we need to be aware of and say, hey, yeah, I could try to go scale this nonprofit 10x in terms of the number of students we serve, but there's going to be consequences to that, and we need to be aware of what that means. That might mean, more mentors that aren't representative of the students we serve, and that creates a real disconnect. Or, that might mean just lower program quality, right? Like, if you got one mentor for every 3 students and now all of a sudden it's 1 for 7 or 8, like how you retain quality is a tricky thing that a lot of people gloss over. So anyway, I totally take your point. I think it's the right way.
Curious to know, with what you've seen with AI, the acceleration of things, consolidation, really having instant access to knowledge and processing to some degree, if you set up the kind of framework or the prompts properly. What are you seeing and maybe excited about or observing in general as it relates to being able to apply this like power or apply this resource to more of the small or maybe mid-size opportunities that prior maybe wouldn't be able to get to that first step? Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly exciting what's possible with, exponentially increasing access to maybe not just information, but like synthesize, like the so what of information, right? Like the outcomes of that information. Some of the areas it's most just exciting from a personal perspective are things like new materials discovery, new seed genomes that can be discovered exponentially more efficiently with way lower cost than they could have been discovered 10 years ago, to make more resilient crops, right? Allow us to feed more people with fewer import resources like water. Those things are really exciting when you think about it, and I can talk about a dozen different startups that we've spoken to or looked closely at that are doing really cool things on that front. And then you mentioned energy. Energy is tricky, right? Because AI is a power beast, and so there's lots of people that are rightly talking about efficiencies that are being created as a result of AI, and that's awesome. But we're still, I think, working hard to circle the square on, how do you get to kind of like with nuclear fusion, like how do you get to net positive energy outcomes on AI, right? Like it's one thing to say, yeah, AI can do all this great stuff, but it's particularly on the energy side, like how do we ensure that, you know, the outputs being spat out on the back end create more efficiencies than all it's sucking up on the front end.
Do you feel like there's a certain kind of opportunity right now, like summer 2026? What is it that kind of has your attention? Or do you have like different tiers of opportunities that you sort of sort things into?
Yeah, but like I'm excited to talk about this, but I just want to say it all comes back to people. Like I had a conversation yesterday with a large institutional investor who invests in funds. And we were talking about capital heavy versus capital light businesses. I think it is fair to say that climate technologies generally lean towards more capital intensive than capital light, right? Like when we're talking about alternative cement as an example, like that's capital intensive, or new nuclear fusion, very capital intensive. Like, you know, things that are paradigm shifters in terms of our like net emissions reductions are usually going to require a lot of capital. And there's a misnomer that capital intensity is bad for early shareholders because you're going to get diluted over time. It's not that that's not true. It's just like it's not inherently dilutive. You just need an operator that understands how to like manage the cost of capital over time and become a bankable business where you can get, you know, 4, 5, 6% debt as opposed to funding everything with equity. But long-winded way of saying, what matters to us most is the person. And it sounds so obvious in venture, but like there are people that are so well suited to run a capital intensive business and so poorly suited to run an AI software company that creates efficiencies. And that doesn't mean we won't invest in either one. It just means you got to match the operator you're backing with what they are building. But all of those operators have to hold some of these paradoxes that we've already discussed today, because many of the best entrepreneurs like have to hold like two very complex, seemingly mutually exclusive skills together in many ways. And so that's what we really spend most of our time looking at, is like how do we find those people and how do we support those people, as opposed to specifically saying, okay, you know, data center efficiency is the future, so I've got to like lock in on just like the most efficient way to cool a data center, or you know, crop genomics is the future, so like I've got to just find the best solution out there that is like, you know, creating a new genome for seeds. But with that said, I want to also answer your question. Like there are some areas we're still interested in. So like one of the companies we backed recently just signed a large agreement that they were public about. It's called Rototherm. They're the first waterless geothermal system. And the reason that matters is some of the water patterns we're seeing are, right? Like if you dig deep on how like aquifers are depleting in certain regions and how water availability is changing and the number of cities that have 0 water days on the horizon, like the world is shifting. And this isn't a doomsday statement. I'm not saying, hey, we're going to run out of water. It's just where water is changing. And in many situations now, we've gone from equilibrium to a bunch of places having too little water and a bunch of places having too much water at a given time, right? As opposed to something 50 years ago that was a little bit more balanced. And so systems that can support, you know, continued commercial growth while limiting your input on an increasingly variable resource like water is really exciting to us. And Rototherm has created the first geothermal system in the world that requires no water. So that's really exciting. And I could talk about lots of other like crazy out there examples of things that we're excited about as well. If that's helpful.
So how do you come across some of these founders or people? Is it through? And then I guess the other part of it is, are you often piecing together teams? Like, for example, you might have a founder who has this idea, but you're looking for an operator. So do you have, I guess I'm curious, from almost like a lead generation perspective, in a marketing sense, like, do you have like a radar out there for, hey, this person would be a great operator for capital intensive, I'm thinking of oil and gas, like someone who's been rigging for like 30 years. That would be, this is an ideal person who might be looking to pair them with someone else who's on the forefront of, the carbon markets,
Yeah. Well, it's so funny you give that specific example. There's a lot to say about this, but the CEO of this particular business has built and sold 2 fracking companies before building this geothermal business. And that's relevant for 2 reasons. One, horizontal drilling is really hard. Like, a lot goes wrong when you're drilling underground. And so that experience has value if you're, doing it the 3rd time. But additionally, this goes back to that point I made about capital intensive versus non-capital intensive. There are very few people that we would have felt comfortable backing running a business like this, because this is the first of a kind system. It's very hard to get bankable for a first of a kind system, right? Like, there's a lot of de-risking that needs to happen. And the CEO of this business is a guy named Curtis Cook. Curtis is the kind of guy that wakes up in the middle of the night sweating, thinking about a cell in an Excel spreadsheet. And the reason I give that example is that's someone who can truly think like a banker and say, this, these are the risks. This is how I de-risk, not in a sort of like theoretical way, but in a so far beyond a reasonable doubt way that is necessary for very conservative institutions to fork over $500 million or $1 billion without significant proof of, success and repeatability. And so it's really a mindset thing. Like, we actually spent a lot of time internally talking about whether that mindset for a business that requires a lot of capital is something you can hire out or just has to be true from founder and CEO from the beginning. Right? There are some traits in a business that just have to be true from the top, from day one. There are others that you can hire out, and this specific trait, specifically for businesses that are very capital intensive, I'm increasingly believing just needs to be true from the top, from day one. Because we have some other businesses that are capital intensive as well, and the highest performing ones have CEOs that are the exact same way. It's just like they obsess over the cells in a spreadsheet and all the sensitivity analyses. As opposed to the average operator that is building something innovative, like they're obsessing about the next tinker on the product, right? Where do I put the next widget to eke out 2% more efficiency? But that's not how you scale something. And as a venture firm, like, we need exceptional scale to be successful.
Where do you see your firm in the next, 5 years out? I know it's almost impossible to guess, where things are 5 years out, but even just on the horizon, like, if you could see what the distant horizon is it in the Canadian market specifically? Are you optimistic of a certain area? Is it industry related specifically to climate across the board, globally? Where do you see it?
So right now we've invested across several geographies. We've got probably about 45% of our investments are in Canada, about 45% of our investments are in the US, and then a little bit less than 10% are in Africa. We are at a really interesting moment in time geopolitically, right? Like, even going back when I was in Poland 10 years ago, isolationism was rising, right? Like, this was right when Trump's first term started, but you can see it across the world, right? There were lots of places that were increasing in their in their intent around sovereignty, and I think Canada is very well positioned in this world we are moving into. I think Mark Carney's Middle Power speech did a good job of articulating that, but Canada has exceptional access to affordable education. Quality of life here is very, very high. There is like a strong economic base here, and look, it's got its problems. We could talk about the problems that exist in the ecosystem up here, but broadly speaking, it's a great place to start a business. It's a great place to access talent, and like other middle powers around the world are interested in accessing Canada, both because of its relationship across North America, and it's like immediate access to the U.S. market, as well as like the systems of support that exist to commercialize some of these really important industries for the next 100 years, like metals extraction, right? Like we need an outrageous amount of copper to electrify all that we need to electrify. Like there's a lot of really strong mining expertise in Canada. Vancouver's home to the headquarters of more mining companies than anywhere in the world. And so I think there's a confluence of factors that make us really, really bullish on building complex businesses in Canada for all those reasons I just shared.
Yeah, one of the things just recently in conversations, just with friends, one friend is just a builder, and we're chatting about GDP, just about this idea, like right down to the household level of like, hey, what is it? Or you're driving through a small community, like what is it that this community is doing that is generating value so that trade exists outside of it? Because even to get those, whether it's a local hardware store in that small town or whether it's dollar store like, materials, which we have, can still be really great quality for things that are needed, tarps and zip ties and whatever, like these things that seem like staples, you would be, it would be odd if you went into a small community and didn't have these things. Yet what is being traded at the global level when the domino is, hits out, or the butterfly effect of what you're doing is actually creating a value exchange. How is that trace all the way back? And if you look at industry, it's interesting to think about what's actually where the value is being created as opposed to just activity, you know?
Well, it's so interesting you say that. I might when I gave my intro, I was talking about rural communities versus urban communities, and bringing the nonprofit we built from an urban area and thinking about rural areas. Really practically speaking, if you think about this and how globalization has negatively impacted smaller areas. If you go to a small town, let's call it 4 hours outside Toronto, or where I was living, 3 hours outside of Memphis. 40 years ago, when you went and bought groceries, you pretty much had to do that in your local community. Now you can buy groceries on Amazon. Like there are all this infrastructure that we've built that allows dollars to flow out of these communities faster than it ever has, without the reciprocal like getting it back into the community. And I think this has created like a pretty deep structural challenge that a lot of places are wrestling with. And interestingly, COVID kind of threw a bit of a monkey wrench in that, because a bunch of people moved out of dense urban areas, at least temporarily, into areas that were a little bit more rural. But I'm going to be really curious to see, over the last couple of years, as the world has normalized, how the flow of dollars continues to move and what that means for opportunity differences between rural and urban, and what that means for things like GDP growth in these areas outside of just monster cities that are overpriced and hard to live in and all that stuff now.
Yeah, with things like real estate, land and whatnot. I think of eggs as an interesting example, very universal. Chickens are a very universal thing, an egg as well, but to take an egg, it can travel so far on its own. If you crack it open and you whisk it and you put it on a freeze dryer tray and you freeze dry it and then you powder it and you put it in a sealed Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, it'll last 25 years, retains its nutrient value. And so in some respect, I've wondered about decentralizing some aspect of food production at a smaller scale level that would create more of the fascia, the ligaments, the tendons that are needed. Quite often if you see someone, they're going to the gym and all they're working out is their bench press and their squat or whatnot, it's inevitable if they're doing more diverse activities that there could be an injury upcoming if it's only major muscles, So that cross training, the nuance, and I really have wondered from an economic standpoint and the readjusting of technology, socioeconomic, geopolitical, cultural shifts, if there may not be a renaissance of cottage industry that pops up where you see an aging, whether it's boomers or, or the next, coming up after them, where you're seeing things like backyard activities, food cultivation, interacting with, children, whether raising them, educating, tutoring, through to these activities. If there's more of a communal aspect of GDP, really like value creation at the neighborhood level, that is actually, doing more of that. And I think in a way, if we think of an oscillating wave, if we've oscillated in the industrial area to such a point where we've gone so far away from intergenerational culture, the great grandparents, the grandparents, the moving so far away to being siloed out and very individualistic, if we're coming back to a point of finding some ground where it's actually like, hey, no, when grandma shows up or mom shows up or the next door neighbor is over, it's not a handout of dropping something on their porch. It's like, no, they actually, that elderly woman comes and sits with our daughters and does tea and teaches them about, she's helping her with her reading, she's helping with her handwriting, she's, or tending to the walks in the garden while, that sort of thing, I think is a very beautiful opportunity in more of the granular detail that I think may be a part of a positive aspect of the picture to come.
Yeah, and it's, even if it's not productive, right? Like even if it's not increasing productivity or GDP, even if it's not helping someone's reading level, like we are built for that type of connection, right? Like I just recently, I have a 6-month-old daughter at home, and my wife and I just implemented a rule where at 6:30 we put our phones in a drawer. It's nothing innovative. It's just like, and I'm shocked at how much more relaxed I've been in the last few weeks just from that, right? Like I feel so much more full, happier, connected than I did even 2 weeks ago. And there are so many things pulling us towards maximal efficiency, maximal screen time, maximal dopamine. So I really think your point is strong, and I'm curious to see how it shakes out in the years to come.
One quick note, when you mentioned that, the one thought that came to mind is mental health. If you look at depression, loneliness, just the lack of it, that tracks. If we're looking at GDP or productivity, where's the price for? Because service in those areas, so let's say medical care in those areas, would constitute as GDP in some respect.
Yeah.
So the actual problem for it, the demand, what has created the problem is somehow creating a demand for this. So in a way it moves the needle. But absent of that, if there's something else that is actually helping to, it's almost like a health food, it's almost like a missing nutrient in a metaphysical way. Yeah. So, but I really appreciate the chat. I think that it's so amazing to see people that are right at they're a part of the catalyst of making things happen. And Sam, it's, I think it's so beautiful to hear you have that early, Fulbright, background, but then the nonprofit aspect and now into the for-profit space. I feel like there's this beautiful kind of symmetry to it, and thank you so much.
Well, thanks for saying that, Caleb. I love the work you do. I really appreciate this conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.